Shalom everyone, and welcome to this online Bible course on the first 5 books of the Bible. I am Father Randy Flores, SVD, the Biblical Apostolate Director for the Diocese of Cubao in Quezon City, and also the Parish Priest of the Sacred Heart Parish Shrine in this city. If you want to follow this course and be notified when there are updates, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can do it now. Thank you.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Ve'ahabta et Adonai Elohecha, bekol levaveka, o bekol nafshecha, o bekol meodeka. Ve'hayu hadebarim ha'ele, asher anochi mesavveka hayom al lebabech. Ve'snantam lebanecha, be'dibartabam, be'shivtecha, be'betecha, o blekteka baderek, o b'shokbecha, o bekomecha. Ugsatam leot al yadecha, ve'hayu letotapot ben enecha, o khtabtam al mezuzot betecha, ubis arecha sela. Magandang gabi po sa kanilang lahat. Welcome sa session number 2. Session number 2 then is the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Of course, the best way to study a book is to read. And fortunately, most of us are familiar sa nilalaman ng Genesis. Praise the Lord. Kasi not all the books are like that. Pero at least yung the very first book of the Bible, kahit siguro malit na bata, they know the stories of Adam and Eve, they know the stories of Noah and the flood, they know the stories of, at least the story of Abraham, of Joseph. In a formal study like this, ang unang tinitignan is a kind of an overall design of the book. Parang table of contents ng libro. Kasi pag una kang bibili ka ng libro, tapos nabasa na, nakita mo magandang cover, maganda yung endorsement sa likod, no? Ang unang titignan niya ng marunong magbasa ng libro, pupunta siya sa table of contents. Titignan niya doon kung gaano ka-organize yung libro o anong nilalaman niya. Kasi table of contents, makikita mo na yung content niya. Kung gaano to kaganda o ka-organize, kung may design ba siya o may tinatawag natin na structure. Kung may structure ba siya, meron siyang balangkas. No? Remember, I told you before that yung libro in the ancient world, no, wala silang mga divisions, walang mga paragraphs. They are not divided into books. Maalala niyo sinabi kong just one scroll like that, tuloy-tuloy. So it's nalang later on when they start to subdivide them. And when they subdivided them, there is a reason why they subdivide this, separate it from that book. They call it next book, second book, third book, fourth book, fifth book. No? So, kasi sa isang libro, there is a what we call a literary design. May design. In a way, no? There is a literary design. Or what we call structure. No? So, you notice right away, there are 2 major parts. Sa libro ng Genesis, makikita mo agad na mayroong na structure yung libro. Meron siyang design. The first 11 chapters tells us of the origin of the world. Experts call this part primeval story. Primus, prime means first. So, it's a story about the first. Story about the beginnings. Okay, so up to chapter 11. And what is chapter 11? The story of the Tower of Babel. Torre ng Babel. Then, once you are out of chapter 11, magsisimula ang kwento tungkol sa ancestors of Israel. So you have the chapters 12 to 50 would be the ancestral story o yung tinatawag natin na stories of patriarchs and matriarchs. So we call it the ancestral. So there are 50 chapters of the book of Genesis divided into 2 parts. No? That's this structure. The first 11 chapters is about the story of the origins of the world. The second focuses more into the story of the ancestors of Israel. So, we call it the ancestral story. And that ancestral story is subdivided into three cycles. We do not use the cycles anymore. Pag nanonood kayo ng Netflix, ang tawag nila dyan ay 3 episodes. Okay? Yung season, yung malaki, yung season would be divided into different episodes. So, parang ganon. So, season 1, primeval story. Okay? Season 2, ancestral story. And yung season ng ancestral story, 3 episodes. Pero, biblical scholars, they call it cycles. Yung buhay nito, buhay ng isa, buhay ng pangalawa, buhay ng pangatlo. First cycle would be the so-called the Abraham cycle, the story of Abraham, and then the Jacob cycle, and then the last is the Joseph cycle. Magtataka kayo, nasaan si Isaac? Well, the narrator, whoever was responsible for the book of Genesis, did not give them a prominent role, no, to devote a kind of a story. Parang sa mga series, teleserye, di ba? May mga character na ganyan. Pero the director or the storyteller, mag-prefer minsan na nakafocus yung isang character niya sa isang tao, yung isang episode niya sa isang tao, pero yung tao na yan, maraming sanga-sanga, maraming mga other people, other characters connected with with the protagonist of the story. Pinag-usapan dito yung story. Okay? So, 3 cycles, the Abraham cycle, the Jacob cycle, and the Joseph cycle. So, that's once again, the structure of the book of Genesis. Point number 2 is to suggest another way of seeing yung book of Genesis, another way of a design, a literary design or structure of the book. So that's one way of seeing yung sinabi ko. That's the usual classical way, yung Genesis 1 to 11, Genesis 12 to 50. Pero other scholars suggest a different one, and it's possible that the book of Genesis can be divided this way. How can it be divided? Generations before the flood and generations after the flood. What do you mean the flood? Flood during the time of Noah. Why do they divide history or structure like that or literary work like that? Because in the ancient world, there are stories like that. Predating yung story ng libro ng Genesis na mas matanda pa kaysa mga libro ng Genesis, merong mga old stories like story of the flood, may character na Gilgamesh, Mesopotamian story, meron ding character na Atrahasis. No? Ito yung mga hero sa flood nung unang panahon, and it seems in that structure, they use yung flood, kasi may flood din as divider, as literary marker sa kanilang. So, may generation before the flood, and then may generation after the flood. Pag titignan ninyo, you observe what's happening right now, I am sure, pagkatapos itong pandemic na ito, we will divide history, modern history, this way. Before the pandemic, after the pandemic. Ganyan ang mangyayari ngayon na division ng kasaysayan natin, modern people. Katulad ng unang panahon, before the war, after the war. Sana umabot na tayo yung after the pandemic. Mapapabilis sana. We ask that God will end this pandemic soon so that we will enter the age of post-pandemic generation. We will be the post-pandemic generation and then the pre-pandemic generation. So that's another way of looking as a whole yung book of Genesis. So, point number 3, the unity of the book of Genesis. Yung libro ng Genesis, what binds them together? Nasabi natin na mayroong mga stories, iba-ibang stories. Yung stories of the origin of the world, divided naman into different stories. Nandyan yung creation of the world, nandyan yung Adam and Eve, the fall, and then Cain and Abel, and so forth and so on until you reach the Tower of Babel. And then, pagdating mo naman sa ancestral story, nandoon yung Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, or the so-called three cycle. So, what binds them to answer that question? The key is pangako ng Diyos. What do you mean pangako ng Diyos? You remember, sa paglalalang, nung one of the favorite quotations ng mga Pinoy, ng mga go and multiply. Be fruitful and multiply. Yung command, yung divine command ng Diyos sa tao, after He created them in His image and likeness, there is the command, be fruitful and multiply. Yung dumami kayo. And that is the key. Kasi pagdating sa kay Abraham, kay Jacob, kahit pa si Noah, laging lumalabas yun, dumami sila so that they will become many. You remember, God promised Abraham to have children as many as stars in the sky and the suns in the seashore. So, yung the promise to be many, it somehow connects the whole book of Genesis, parang thread na tinatahi niya yung iba-ibang parte ng Genesis. So, that's structure and unity. Pag sinabing unity, do not think of unity na pagkakaisa. Hindi tao nagkakaisa dito. Unity means literary unity. Yung unity ng story. I'm not thinking about unity of people. No. Unity of story. Na yung iba-ibang elemento ng Genesis, iba-ibang parte, iba-ibang istorya na ma-encounter mo dyan, parang kung nanonood ka meron akong pinapanood sa Netflix na Japanese series, Midnight Diner, yung restaurant, may-ari ng restaurant, pagdating ng alas 12 ang hating gabi, magbubukas na siya ng restaurant kasi yung restaurant niya para sa mga midnight people, yung nagtatrabaho ng bago umuwi sa bahay, yung mga panggabi. So, nagbubukas siya hating gabi. So, kakain sila sa kanyang restaurant at habang kumakain sila, doon nag-encounter na yung mga tao, may makasari-sarili silang mga kwento. So, every episode, may pinofocus na kwento ng isang karakter, ng isang tao. Yung isa, sex worker, yung isa, tungkol sa buhay niya. Yung isa naman ay dating sikat na singer, na laos na. So, napofocus lang. But what binds yung stories together? It's the restaurant. Midnight Diner Restaurant. So, parang ganon. What binds those stories together in the book of Genesis is the promise to be many. Kasi paulit-ulit yon. Sa Genesis 1 to 11, hanggang kay Abraham, Jacob, hanggang kay Joseph, yung pagdami pa rin ang isa sa mga tema o major theme doon. The divine promise to be many. Number 4, naalala niyo yung sinabi ko noon, the importance of the literary form o genre to understand a particular biblical passage or text or a book. First thing usually is to identify what kind of genre, literary style is the text in front of you. Kasi that will be your entry point to understand the text. Hindi ko na ito uulitin. Balikan nyo na rin yung sinabi ko last meeting of how important is genre. Now, sa Genesis, you can identify two major genre. The genre of story, okay, and genealogy. Wala masyadong law doon, as I said before, no? Yung laws, utos o habilin, mga batas, commandments and statutes, you will find them later. Pero in the book of Genesis, no such legal text, but stories, stories, stories. And not only stories, but also genealogy. Question now is, are these stories that you read also history? May pagkakaiba ba yung story at history? Yes. Yung history is kasaysayan. It's based on the records, evidence of the past. Yung story can be fiction. Ano mong tawag yan? Kwento. O hindi na siya kasaysayan. So, that's the big question here in the book of Genesis. Story, halimbawa, yung kina Abraham, Isaac, is this story or history? Oh, definitely, yung Genesis 1 to 11 are stories. But what is a story? Yung mga biblical writers, when we notice that they were not writing, hindi sila mga historians. They were what? People with faith who would like to proclaim the message of God. Believers of Yahweh, believers of Elohim. No? May pananampalataya sila. Gusto nilang i-preserve yung kanilang pananampalataya. So, hindi sila gumagawa ng kasaysayan. Hindi sila historiador. Yung nagre-research, tinitignan nila kung may mga basis yung sinasabi nila. Halimbawa, gumawa ako ng maikling kasaysayan ng Sacred Heart Parish Shrine. Pupunta pa ako doon sa mga archives. Titignan ko yung mga exchange ng letters nung unang pare, nagre-report siya sa SVD sa Rome. Doon pag-aaralan mo yung sinasabi niya as documents, based on written records. The Bible writers were not like that, and they were not historians. So we cannot therefore say absolutely 100% that is history. But we can say that it is a story. But the story is a story of the past, and this is a very important line here, that teaches us or tells us of a salvific truth. Kasi pag sinabi mong, istorya lang yan, parang inisip mo agad, hindi totoo. Magkaiba po yun. Magkaiba yung kahit story lang, it possesses a different degree of truthfulness. I'll give you an example. Recent example. Merong congressman sa Congress, no? May problema siya doon sa isang network. Kaya nga, ayaw niyang ibigyan ng franchise, yung network na yon. You know it already, kung ano yung franchise na yon. Isa sa mga problema niya ay dahil yung mga kwento na pinapalabas ng network na ito ay puro mga puro ang mga congressman ay kontrabida, sabi mo lang, yung mga nasa gobyerno na So, tinatamaan siya, story lang 'yon, kwento lang 'yon. But the story, as I said, has a different degree of truth. Kaya tinamaan yung congressman kasi the truth of the story is also true. Pag sinabi kong yung libro ng Genesis the genre is a story, I am not belittling the historical aspects of the book. No, because a story has a different degree of truth. And what kind of truth is that? Well, we call it the salvific truth. No? Writers, those who are responsible for the book of Genesis, they were not historians. They did not intend to write as a history of Abraham, the history of Jacob, the history of Joseph. No, they were interested to tell us the story about our salvation, the salvific truth. Okay, so we can therefore, say with all humility that when I see the book of Genesis, I am not thinking of history here. I am thinking of a story. But the story that I am thinking is not just a simple fiction that has nothing to do with real life. No, a story that tells of the past, but telling us about our salvation, salvific true. The second genre, ngayon, hindi nyo na mapapansin masyado ito kasi English translation na. Pero how many times babanggitin yung Hebrew word na toledoth? Toledoth, literally, is the genealogy, translation niya from Hebrew. Hebrew word ito, toledoth. And variously translated sa Bible. Sometimes the story of the generation of, the story of. So iba-ibang kasi hindi mo agad mapansin. Pero yung 27 genealogy sa Biblia, kasama na yung New Testament. May dalawa doon sa New Testament, as we all know. Yung story, genealogy ni Jesus sa Gospel of Matthew, and then another version sa Gospel of Luke. So, 27 genealogies in the Bible. Pero 11 of this toledoth or genealogy ay nasa Genesis. Yung creation, second story ng creation, chapter 2, verse 4 ng book of Genesis, it says, "These are the generation of the heavens and the earth." For example, chapter 2, verse 4. Check nyo yung Bible ninyo. That's the first mention of the word toledoth or genealogy in the Bible. These are the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created. Notice that even cosmic realities can have genealogy. Hindi lang tao ang pwedeng magkaroon ng genealogy. Pati yung heavens and the earth, meron din siyang genealogy. And then, chapter 5, verse 1, this is the genealogy of Adam. Then chapter 6, verse 9, the genealogy of Noah, and so forth and so on. So, 11, all and all, sa libro ng Genesis. So, makikita mo, significant yung genealogy, yung toledoth, biro mo. Anong function ng genealogy? Ano ang function niya? Malimit kasi, genealogy, sabihin mo, family tree, ganyan. Modern yun. Yung gagawa ka ng sarili mong family tree, yan yung genealogy mo. So, they can based from those ancient stories, the genealogies in the Bible would have two functions. They notice that whenever there is a genealogy, it either introduces a new story or concludes a story. So it begins now a new story. So yan yung isa niyang function. So halimbawa, kanina, binasa ko yung chapter 2, verse 4 na genealogy ng heaven and the earth kasi natapos na yung first story ng creation. The first story of creation begins from Genesis chapter 1 until Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 or 4a. So, sa verse 4, matatapos na siya doon yung story ng first story. Kaya, sasabihin niya, genealogy of heaven and earth. So, you see, it marks the beginning or the end of a story. They are literary markers. Now, kaya, tignan mo yung Ebanghelyo ni Mateo, the Gospel of Matthew, did you notice that the first passage that you encounter in the Gospel of Matthew, the very first thing when you begin to read the New Testament, kasi yung Matthew ang first writing sa listahan ng New Testament. Yun yung una mong mababasa, Matthew. Ano ang pinakauna niyang passage? Genealogy of Jesus. Kasi that signals that a new age has dawned. No? A new story is about to begin. And that's the story of Jesus. You see, there are literary markers. They mark the story. So, pag nagbabasa kayo, at ma-encounter yung genealogy, magsisimula na yung another episode, and that 4th episode is about to be concluded. Second, which is more theological, ay yung toledoth, yung genealogy, ay also to determine who belongs o who belong to the promise. Sino yung kasama doon sa pangako ng Diyos? Kaya may genealogy. Outside the genealogy, you are not, that generation or that name, those names do not belong to the promise. So it delineates yung history of salvation through the genealogy. Kaya kung may genealogy si Adam, si Noah, si Shem, si Terah, tatay ni Abraham si Terah, si Ishmael, si Isaac. Si Ishmael will have a separate genealogy kasi ihihiwalay siya doon sa promise. Iba yung genealogy. May sarili din siyang salinlahi. Hindi siya doon sa salinlahi ni Isaac, ni Jacob. So, Jacob ay yung last na genealogy sa book of Genesis. So, two functions of genealogy is a genre sa Genesis, very prominent, we should say, kasi nga 11 out of 27, 11 ang toledoth na nasa Genesis. And what are the functions of this? First, they mark the beginning or end of a story. You are now into a new episode, a new season, and then it also determines who belong or who does not belong to the divine promise of God, which is, of course, Israel, chosen people of God. Kasama na si Jesus. Kaya may genealogy. It was very important that Jesus has a genealogy because it traces him to the promise. Biro mo kung si Jesus, outside of that genealogy, he does not belong to the long history of salvation promised to Israel. When was this book of Genesis written? Well, the setting of these stories is like 2,000 years before the time of Christ. O yung called, yung buhay ng tao dyan ay nomadic. So yun yung setting ng story. Pero you are not thinking of the setting of the story now. We are thinking of when itong libro na ito was composed. Ano yung context niya? Magkaiba po yun. Halimbawa, ako ay gumagawa ng kwento, gumagawa ko ng story. The setting of my story is 500 years ago, pero my context is 2020 na may pandemic. So, naturally, yung context mo will influence what you are saying, what you are doing, what you are writing. Tingnan niyo yung mga homily ng mga pari ngayon. Lahat tungkol sa pandemic. No? Kasi nasa context sila, even if they talk about Jesus, nung wala pang pandemic, hindi mo may relate yung gospel sa pandemic. Kasi wala ka namang idea what is pandemic. Dahil may pandemic na, yung homily namin, pati yon nasa context kami ng pandemic, pati sinasabi namin, ay binabasa namin si Jesus, may pandemic na din sa Biblia. That is because your context influences what you wrote. Like our writer. So it is important then to us when say, when was this written? Dahil doon mo maintindihan yung context nung gumawa. Literature na ito, of course, inspired by God, and their context enable us, give us a hint of what problems they are sorting out and what challenges they were facing and how they were influenced by their experience in their writing down the biblical text. So yun yung tanong na when. So kung yung setting ng Bible stories natin ng Genesis would be something like 2,000 years before Christ, yung context ng writer or writers ay only around 586 BC, which what we call the Babylonian exile. Yun yung theory ng mga scholars na malamang itong libro ng Genesis were composed maybe during the exile when they were taken out from Israel, from Jerusalem, out to be in Babylonia for around 50 years there, and there they begin to collect. They began to edit, to put together the materials which will compose the book of Genesis. I'll give you an example now. Let's take the example, the story of the flood. Kasi nasa context tayo ng pandemic, disaster, natural disaster. So, maybe it's good to cite this as an example. The biblical narrative of the flood. Where will you find it? Genesis chapter 6 to 9. Bibliography means yung mga pinagkuhanan ko ng ideas. Hindi ko ideas ito, kundi I borrowed them from scholars themselves. Now, few introductory remarks sa pagbabasa ng Genesis 6 to 9, the story of the flood. Yung question of, again, historicity. Saan ba yung ark ngayon? Nasaan yung mountain kung saan umano yung ark? No? Those are, I should say, not significant questions even for scholars. They don't dwell on those trivial questions. Kung nasaan yung Mount Ararat na yan, nasaan yung... Because we all know that we are dealing with stories. We are not dealing with concrete, modern history. That's what I was telling a while ago. So we would not go and then suot namin mga botas namin at ang aming mga pala at pupunta kami, huhukayin namin nasaan yung mountain na yan o hahanapin namin yung lost ark. The more important thing to do is, when you read the Bible, you wrestle with the text, with the passage, You engage yourself with the text. Try to read it. Sabi ko sa mga students ko sa seminary, read. Meaning 3 times, not only once, twice, but 3 times. Don't presume that you already know the text. Remember, the text is inspired by God. It can change anytime. Meaning, sometimes you have a new idea, a new insight. So, that's the first, you engage with the text. Pay attention to its narrative style, its narrative art, because its genre reveals the intention of the author. Di ba sabi natin yan? Then, these chapters, this story, what is the role of this in the whole book of Genesis? Bakit mayroong story na ito? Bakit may flood story? Anong function niya sa libro ng Genesis? Kung galing man itong story sa outside world, outside na context, halimbawa, yung meron ka diyang mga stories na pala, yung editor, kinuha niya, inilagay niya dito, yung isang story na ito, 6 to 9. Pero anong function nun? Why are the stories here? Then, number 4, sinabi ko na naman kanina, yung historical circumstances out of which this text emerged. Ano yung ibig sabihin yan? Yung sinabi ko na kanina na yung context ng text mismo, tatanungin mo, hindi yung panahon ni Moses, hindi yung panahon, o panahon ni Noah, those are stories. No? Pero panahon nung gumawa ng story, panahon nung kinumpose yung story, circumstance noong kinulek yung story. Kasi context influences historical, economic, political context influences the activity of a person. Kaya marireveal yung meaning of that text by understanding the historical circumstances out of which this text emerged. I gave you already many examples kanina, yung preaching ng pare during the pandemic. Those are things, they are related. Okay. Now let's go to the plot or the literary unity of the story of the flood. Genesis 6 to 9. Well, first, God discovers the wickedness of humanity, and then God decides to destroy the universe. And then Noah is introduced as the only just person at the time. Let's move. And then God asks Noah to build an ark. Then Noah enters the ark together with his family and samples of all animals of the world. And then the flood starts. All living beings perish in the water except Noah and all those with him in the ark. After the flood, the earth dries up. Noah goes out with his family and all those on board. Then God gives an assurance for the existence of the universe after the flood. Common plot, Kasi lagi na natin narinig yung plot niya, which itself is already a unity. Okay, now, but with significant contradictions. Example, chapter 6, verse 5. The reason for the flood. Kung may Bible kayo, okay, anong sabi doon? The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So, anong dahilan na magpapadala ng Diyos ng flood? Chapter 6, verse 5. Wickedness of humankind and every thought, makshabot, sabi ng Hebrew, every makshabot thought, yung makshabot, libbo sa kanilang heart, lib is heart, libbo ay ra, evil, inward wickedness. Pag-iisip mo, masama, the reason, in 6.5. Pero pag basahin mo yung 6.11, sama mo na yung verse 13, iba ang reason for the flood. Now, verse 11, the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. Hamas in Hebrew. Dito ay makshebot. Hebrew na tayo. Makshebot means evil thoughts. Doon naman sa karahasan, contradiction. Another, the divine command. In 6:19 to 20, the divine command, yung sinabi ng Diyos kay Noah, and of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind. 2 of every kind into the ark. Pagdating mo sa chapter 7, verse 2, divine command. Sabi ng Diyos kay Noah, go into the ark. And then in verse 2, sabi niya, take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals. Oh, akala ko ba? 2 of every kind. Ngayon, bilis naman magpalit ng isip ng Diyos. 7 pairs of all clean, 7 pairs of all clean animals. Kanina, 2 of every kind. Clean or unclean, lahat, pasok. Eh, pagdating ng few verses away, after 7 of all clean animals. See? Contradiction. Number 3, the duration of the flood. Now, chapter 8 tayo, verse 6. At the end of 40 days. Kaya nga, meron tayo yung quarantine. No? Quarantine. Pero, chapter 7, verse 6. Chapter 8, verse 13. What is chapter 8, verse 13? Okay? Chapter 8, verse 13 says that noong lumabas na si Noe, pagkatapos ng flood, he was 600 first year. Meaning, 601. Nung pumasok siya, 600 years old lang siya. So, one part of the story tells us yung flood ay 40 days, 40 nights. Another part of the story is telling us it's 1 year. Like here, footnote. Huwag na kayong magtaka sa mga number, yung super edad ng mga ninuno ng ancient Israel. That's very common in the ancient world. As is a literary style, paglalagay ng mga overage ng mga tao, exaggerated number of years. Not because wala silang pandemya noong unang panahon na yan, not because kumakain sila ng masusustansya. No. It's just that the older the story, the older that they project the story is, yung mga age ng mga characters nila are also very, very old. Like Noah is, how many years old dito? 601 years old. Bata pa nga si Noah. Pag i-compare mo sa mga hari noong Mesopotamia, yung kanilang mga taon, yung mga years of kanilang reign, isang hari doon, ang kanyang reign is 32,000 years. Si Noah, 600 years lang. So, it's a literary genre, literary style. Another, the cause of the flood. In 7:11, the cause of the flood, ano bang dahilan ng flood? No? In 7 verse 11, ang dahilan ng flood ay rain. Kalagay doon. No? The cause of the flood is the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. In 7 verse 12, anong dahilan ng flood? Because the fountains burst forth and the windows of heaven opened. Magkaiba yung dahilan nung bakit nagka-baha. Dito, umulan ng umulan for 40 days and 40 nights. And the other text telling us the cause of the flood is because the fountains of the abyss, sa ilalim ng lupa, pumutok yung fountains. So the understanding nila of cosmology ng unang panahon, yung pagtingin nila sa mundo, may tubig sa taas, may tubig sa ibaba. Kaya nga pag maghukay ka ng balon, may tubig doon. No? Yun yung nag-burst forth. It burst forth. No? Pumutok ang fountains sa ilalim, sa abyss. Yun ang dahilan na bumaha. Pero yung isang text, sinabi niya, ang dahilan ng bumaha, umulan ng 40 days, 40 nights. Kasi significant contradiction. Nung paglabas nila sa ark, in chapter 8, verse 6 to 12, lalabas na nila sa ark. Well, you have the famous story there of a raven being sent out first, dahan-dahan, no? Babalik-balik yung raven until sa time that the dove sent out did not return anymore. That's the more famous story. Pero pagdating mo sa 8:15 verse 17, walang ganon. God said to Noah, "Go out of the ark, and your wife and your sons and your wives with you, bring me." So, utos, go out now. Go out. Wala yung merong raven muna and then naging yung slow checking of kung dry na yung land. Another problem there would be the different names. Sometimes ginagamit na name ay YHWH, which is translated into English as Lord, and then Elohim, which is translated as God in modern translations. So, you see, pag closer reading of the text, there are what we call doublets. No? Anong theory ng mga scholars dyan? Sabi nila, maybe originally there were two stories blended together by an editor. So that's one theory, which makes sense. No? There were two stories put together. Kaya may story A, may story B. They were merged or blended. So, nag-fusion, may mga restaurant na fusion na ganyan. And so, parang ang smooth na ning story, but then upon closer look, makikita mo na merong significant differences. Another theory is that there's this story, and then later on, some parts are added, no? To embellish the story. There's a reason, there are reasons why they do that. Depende sa context nila. Bawa, they have the story already, but then later on, the scribes who would read these stories would feel that, another story can also be part of this story. And so they added them at a later stage in the production of the text. And they did it very well na pag binasa mo ngayon, smooth ang dating. Unless you really, katulad ng mga scholars na titignan nila linya-linya, mapapansin nila yung pagkakaiba. Yan. So, ang conclusion natin, let's now move to the conclusion. Number 1, obviously, ang book of Genesis, one text, but many authors, collectors, those who blended them together, those who edited them. So, to the question that did Moses write the Pentateuch, that would be a question that we will say, yes, he wrote in the sense that he is the inspiration of this book, but to be the author of everything here, in the sense na siya ang may akda, would not do justice to the differences that are emerged dito sa Genesis. So, one text but many authors. That's a reason that there are significant differences at times yung text, for reasons that have something to do with the present context that Israel was in. Why did they do that? Well, for reasons that have something to do with their present context that Israel was in. Now, I'll give you an example, and I think this is the last thing here. Let's go back to the reasons for the flood. Ano ba yung bakit nagpadala ng Diyos ng flood? The flood story is a very ancient story. I mentioned to you na even predating yung book of Genesis, may mga stories na about the flood in ancient Mesopotamia na na-wipe out lahat ang sanlibutan, na may mga hero katulad ni Gilgamesh or Atrahasis na nag-survive sa flood. So, may mga stories na. No, bakit sa tingin ng mga biblical writers, the first story of the flood, ang dahilan ay dahil violence, nakalagay ito, Hamas. Okay? Then later on, pumasok yung isang story, pumasok yung isang part ng passage explaining that the reason for is the evil heart of the human being. Hamas is violence. Karahasan. So you notice that yung unang dahilan, maybe ito yung dahilan na nakuha nila sa stories ng ancient world, na ang dahilan ng inayawan ng Diyos ang sanlibutan at nasira dahil nga sa sobra ng karahasan ng tao. Pero upon a closer look, yung mga Israel scribes gumawa, they have an insight based on their present context. No, where does violence come from? Saan nanggagaling yung karahasan ng tao? Why can he become violent to the point that he can kill a human being and it can be very bad? It's because of the evil heart, what is inside. So, they have a new reflection dito sa pagtingin nila sa kasamaan ng tao na hindi nanggagaling sa labas, kundi nanggagaling sa kalooban ng tao. So, that has to be cleansed, that has to be purified. Ito po si Father Randy Flores, SVD, Secretary at Parish Shrine, Quezon City, Director ng Biblical Apostolate ng Diocese of Cubao. Good night and God bless.